get started now.
Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hiro Aragaki. I'm the director of the Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution here at UC Law San Francisco, and also a professor of law here. This week, we're very fortunate to be able to have Bruce Edwards, who is a mediator and arbitrator at JAMS, and who's really been at the forefront of the ADR field for many, many decades. Since 1986, he has mediated over 8,000 disputes throughout the United States involving complex, multi-party lawsuits and specializing in matters of high emotion. He also teaches advanced mediation skills to mediators, attorneys, and judges throughout the country and also around the world. In 2014, he co-founded the Edwards Mediation Academy, an online educational platform for delivering virtual mediation training to a global audience. Bruce, we're really thrilled to be able to engage with you today. And also to count you as one of our distinguished ADR alums. So the title of Bruce's talk is Mediation Begins With Me, a look at self-reflection, self-management, and self-compassion, which, among other things, will look at the type of self-reflection and personal development that mediators can benefit from to improve their competency in high-conflict cases with high emotional stakes. So Bruce will speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A period. If you're joining us via Zoom, please do raise your Zoom hand. The chat box is not open, so we can't see any comments that you might put in the chat box. And if you're here with us in person, please do join us for the in-person reception following the talk. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Hiro, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for your gracious gift of time this evening. It's great to be back at what I used to know as Hastings, now UC Law. I'm from the class of 1981, and it's just good to report that I'm not being triggered by any emotions as I come back repetitively now to campus. Just got back from a teaching experience in Middle East and Africa, where I visited 5 countries in 24 days, teaching and talking with a lot of government officials and judges, and going to law schools, British University in Egypt, the National Law School in Rwanda, different places. And there's a strong appetite for mediation skill development, and it's something we obviously try and attend to and address in a variety of ways. But as I often say in class, the danger in life is not knowing what you don't know. And in the context of mediation training, the danger is not knowing what you should know. And when I talk to law students, particularly, if not young mediators, people are quick to ask questions about different kinds of skills. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a part of the training process itself. Last summer, I started traveling again after the pandemic, and I went to visit a friend of mine in Austria who I've taught with for years, who's a psychotherapist and mediator himself. And we were just kind of talking a little bit about what we'd been doing during the pandemic, particularly online education and training, and how that was going for both of us. And one of the things that we sort of landed on was this idea that what's really lacking for many programs, I'm sure not UC Law San Francisco, but what's really lacking in a lot of training programs is the notion that before you can be helpful, engaging, and if not therapeutic at times in helping other people, you have to really learn more about yourself. And people are quick to default to the skill development side of mediation training, but really without an honest assessment of themselves or the importance of self-reflection and self-management. And so we began sort of talking about that. I tried to put my thoughts on paper on the flight home. I wrote a blog about it. Actually, I just received a publication yesterday, which was the first publication for the Supreme Court in India, where we've been teaching for a number of years. They invited me to participate in their colloquium, and I wrote the article on this very topic for the first compendium of articles for the India Supreme Court. But mediation by definition, as we all know, is a facilitated negotiation. And the word facilitated obviously connotes the introduction of a third person into the room, if not into the dispute. And along with that third person, we bring all of our humanness, right? We bring all of our life experience, we bring all of our own emotions, we bring all of our frustrations, we bring all of our biases, both good and bad. You know, we're the next layer of stuff going on in that room. And as a consequence, we really have to pay attention to that from the beginning. What are we bringing into that room? And that starts with self-reflection. Self-reflection was once defined as the art of looking inward so that the view looking outward can be more clear. And that's really a simple statement of what self-reflection is all about. Self-reflection in mediation is particularly important because of the nature of our practice. You know, every day I do what I do behind closed doors. I do it without peer review. I do it without opportunity, you know, for too many people to provide constructive criticism. Yeah, you get feedback from parties, good and bad, based on how the dispute is going. But that's not always at a level that's as helpful as one would want to have. And so one of the things I've done, or a couple things I've done since the beginning of my career, is try and keep a bit of a learning journal. And at the early stage of my career, I used to have a form I would fill out. And yeah, I would try and capture some of the demographics about the dispute for statistical, purposes. But the biggest part was what I learned from that mediation. What experience did I have that worked for me? What experience that maybe I tried something that didn't work? And just being self-reflective in a journal-type setting was extraordinarily important. We talk a lot about the benefits of establishing reflective groups, and that's absolutely true for all the reasons that I just said. You finally have the ability to get together with like-minded people who share common training, if not similar experiences. Hopefully you broaden the reflective group to include people from different aspects of the profession, and you learn from each other. I used to call it, before I was smart enough to realize these were actually reflective groups, I called them breakfast clubs, because it was just a way of sort of getting people together outside of the mediation room to learn from each other in an informal setting. But the concept is really about reflecting. And the other piece of reflective learning, because life is really about experiences, and we learn from experiences, but we really learn mostly from reflective experiences. And so the opportunity to continue learning and reading in a multitude of disciplines is an important part of that self-reflection as you progress in your career. I read about things that seemingly are unrelated at times to the mediation work that I do, whether it is about genetics or it's about game theory. Certainly negotiation is related, sometimes neurobiology, a variety of disciplines that at first blush may have no real direct relation to what I do day in and day out. But I assure you I learn from all of those types of reading, and they do help my practice. Self-reflection is just the starting point. Self-reflection is the mindset. Mahatma Gandhi said it best when he said, if you want to go out and change the world, start by changing yourself. And I think it's imperative that young mediators particularly get an idea of who you are as you're beginning your nascent journey in this profession. Who am I? And honestly, being self-reflective, I ask students and challenge them to talk to spouses, talk to family members, talk to close friends, with a variety of specific questions and skills to be measured so that you can better understand from where you start. How do you know where you're making progress in your journey? How do you know where you're headed ultimately if you don't know from where you began? And that's really what self-reflection is all about. So do things like the questions that we've talked about. Take self-assessment tests. I mean, everybody has these things available on the internet these days, whether it's Harvard implicit bias or it's Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, or a variety of other self-assessment techniques that are widely available. They can be done confidentially and quickly and give you greater insight into yourself. So think about that level of self-analysis. And really, the question is, ultimately, how can you be helpful to other people? How can you help other people be reflective if you haven't thought about being reflective yourself? And that's why those going into therapeutic science do 1,500-hour internships and go through self-analysis themselves before they're really given a green light to enter the profession. If self-reflection is the opportunity to identify yourself at a greater level of understanding, a deeper level of understanding, then self-management is how you go about addressing it. And so the question really becomes, what are we talking when we talk about self-management? I think we often confuse self-management in the mediation world with kind of the self-help books that you see in the business community. And so, oftentimes in the business sector, self-management is sort of about time management and specific techniques people can do to be more efficient and more effective. The idea of self-management in mediation is less about efficiency, and it's more about how we become effective. It's less about acquiring specific skills, and it's more about acquiring social competencies. And so let's talk a little bit about self-management. Self-management, sort of the taproot for this discussion, is what I call the self-management triangle. And ancient Greeks sort of looked at life as a compilation of mind, body, and spirit. And I think that's as helpful a tool as any in terms of trying to better define what self-management looks like. If you envision a triangle, obviously with equal sides, we'll talk about, in turn, self-management of the mind, we'll talk about self-management of the body, and we'll talk about self-management of the spirit, really effectively dealing with emotions. Those are the three aspects of what I want to discuss in the minutes that we have together. Self-management of the mind. Years ago, I developed a term in mediation training. I call it the mediator's mind. When I developed it years ago, it was a pretty simplistic moniker. It really didn't have a neurobiological basis, if you will. But I've learned more over the years about neurobiology, and I've learned how important the mediator's mind really is. And the concept is this: the mediator's mind is a psychological construct. It's really a way of thinking about your interventions in mediation that will define your moment-to-moment interventions. It will influence how you design mediation processes. It will influence how much time you spend listening to people in mediation. It will influence how you respond in the presence of high emotions. It'll even influence simplistic things like the kinds of words you use in conversation with others. It certainly will dictate how I approach mediations from an evaluative standpoint, and ultimately things like my willingness to even follow up cases. The simplest example is, if your mediator's mindset is you're envisioning yourself as a court annex mediator, nothing wrong with that, but the environment you're in, the conflict environment, is being handed 3 or 4 files every morning by the court clerk to take out in the hallway or the mediation center in the courthouse and deliver back stamped files as either resolved or unresolved. That's going to set a certain mindset. It'll be influencing all these parameters that I've just suggested. Conversely, if you're a commercial mediator and you have the luxury of some time and you've got a mental mindset that I'm here, yes, to get a case resolved, because we know in the commercial world that's what people pay attention to, but also to look for transformative moments, to rebuild communication that maybe has failed, between disputants, or otherwise look to add value in ways that might not be readily apparent. And if that's your mindset, as I said already, that's going to influence how you approach people from the moment they first pick up the phone and introduce themselves to you to the very end of your handling with that case. So think about your mindset, because it is going to be the North Star. It'll be that mental model that at difficult times in mediation, if you need to just take a walk into an empty room or down a hallway and sort of think about what it is I'm trying to accomplish, who it is I'm trying to be, it'll help guide you back to probably the right answer more times than not when you're confronting a difficult choice or a difficult moment. I'll give you another example. I was telling the class I spoke to before this hour about different techniques I use for mindfulness. One of those is putting a hand on the doorknob and taking a deep breath before I walk into a room to confront whatever's about to confront me. But part and parcel of that same exercise, I use that as an opportunity to reground myself in my mental model by reminding myself that I'm a guest. I've had this debate over the years. Some people say host, but either a guest or a host at someone else's dispute. And if I consciously think of that as I am about to enter the room, it sets my skills in a direction that are going to be well received by and large, are going to allow me to be attentive to what people have to say, and to not be inappropriate in any way, including evaluative, because How can you be a guest at somebody else's dispute and start telling people what they need to do? That's an example of the mental model I'm talking about. We talked about this also in the other class earlier, but life is focused attention, and your mental model being one of bringing mindfulness to the mediation and bringing focused attention to all aspects of the mediation, particularly things like controlling your inner voice, particularly things like providing the type of listening that people have the right to deserve in conflict, meaning listening without judgment to the extent possible, listening for connection, not for criticism or correction, listening for developing empathy and rapport and trust, listening for the things that are not being said as much as you're listening for the things that are. That's a quality of listening that few of us have achieved. Certainly many don't even aspire to, and often requires a bit of unlearning from our legal education. So think about that as you develop your self-management of the mind. With regard to self-management of the mind, I spoke about this in the last hour as well. Recognizing the importance of deceleration, one of my favorite words in mediation training, helping people appreciate that it's a process, and to be true to the process, you need to allow it to play out over time. There's a saying in mediation you're all familiar with: the right answer at the wrong time, still the wrong answer. I have to remind myself of that periodically when I'm tempted to try and rush to something that I think I can see clearly in the future, but it doesn't matter. My clarity isn't what is the question. It's the clarity of the people who are in front of me. So reminding myself that small bites, small objectives, one step at a time, slowing down, being less aggressive in what I'm trying to accomplish moment to moment, generally serves me well and certainly serves the process well. So think about that as you think about managing the mind of a mediator. The next topic, of course, is self-management of the body. And here we've got really sort of both the outward-facing perspective on body management, we've got the inward-facing perspective. In terms of the outward-facing lessons, we spent a lot of time learning to understand body language. Clark and I were talking on the walk over here about micro expressions a little bit and lie detection and that sort of thing. We all pay attention to how to read body language in others, but an equal amount of attention needs to be paid to our own presentation. I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic and the fact that I spent every waking moment in mediation on a Zoom platform for 2.5 years was the awful experience of looking at myself continuously. And but it gave me insight. It gave me insight because I could see for the first time, I could match up a facial expression with both what I was saying, what I was intending to communicate, and in some instances, figuring out that my facial expression really wasn't even consistent with what I was trying to communicate. And those opportunities to really bring your thinking and body awareness in sync is really a productive aspect of managing one's body. So really trying to better understand how we come across to other people is an important part of self-awareness, self-management. There are other aspects of self-awareness and body management. Years ago, when I was a student of psychology before I came to my education here, and I remember one of the classes, they talked about a concept of stereotypies, a word I've never forgotten. And stereotypies was a physical manifestation in response to stresses in one's environment. So, for example, if I'm sitting here and I'm nervous because I'm, up here talking in front of a group and I don't really talk publicly too much, I'm tapping my fingers, I'm tapping my toes. That's a physical manifestation, and becoming aware of that is part of self-management. More recently, working with my psychotherapist friend, professionally in mediation training, I'll add, he talks about these being somatic markers. Somatic markers are those physical indications of stresses in your environment. Again, the obvious example I used in the class earlier today, you open your computer, you see that an email has come in from the boss or somebody, you haven't even read the email yet, but all of a sudden your jaw clenches and your fists tighten and you're having a physical response to some anxiety that name alone evokes in you. So learn to be aware of these somatic markers in your body. Physically, we talked last hour about the importance of physical preparation, emotional preparation. We're going to talk about emotions in a moment. But we need to learn to master our physical selves, both in terms of preparation for mediation, in terms of how we confront others and appear with others in mediation. And it's an often overlooked aspect of self-management, because so often we sort of think we are who we are and we don't pay attention to the detail and we just communicate and it is what it is. It needs to be more thoughtful. Let's talk about self-management of spirit or emotions. One of my favorite topics in mediation training, frankly, because it's evolved so quickly, all things considered, right? I mean, if you think back 250 years of evolution of our American judicial system, 400 if you go back to Great Britain and England, and what did we learn in all of that time, at least up to the last couple decades? Justice was all about the facts and the law. Right? That's what the courtroom is all about. You learned in law school to apply the law to the facts and come up with a conclusion. What do we call that? IRAC or something. I don't remember an E in that equation, thinking back on my legal education, E for emotions. Yet, my background in psychology served me well, because when I was a young lawyer here in San Francisco, and I became dissatisfied to some degree with how my clients were responding to the process I was putting them through, emotions and how emotions played out was a large part of that culture shift that I brought about. It was a paradigm shift that occurred within me first. When we went out to the courthouse just across the street and we would go in to talk about settling a case, I remember vividly in some emotional cases, my client sat on the hard wooden bench out in the hallway. We'd disappear as lawyers into the judge's chambers, have a conversation, brief as it was, argue our positions. Judge would say, you go tell your client we need to get her there. Bruce, you go tell your client we need to get her there. And you'd walk outside in the courthouse, take your client for a walk in the hallway, and they would look at you like, what the heck did you just do for me? Nothing. Right? Emotionally, we did nothing in that process. That was the problem, and that was what was so clear to me. And that's why I started experimenting with bringing people together, starting with the clients and their lawyers, and ultimately experimenting with things that became the mediation process, and then taking lessons from how that was applied in family law and applying it to commercial cases. We were off and running in this new career of ours, commercial mediation. So the idea that emotions were really out of the equation for hundreds of years, and they still are to a large degree. I mean, in the context of the learning environment, you say, yeah, we talk about emotions now, and that's a wonderful thing, but not everywhere does that happen. A couple years ago, before the pandemic, I was on one of my many teaching trips to Rwanda, site of one of the worst genocides in world history. And I'll never forget, in class one day, I was turning the book open to today's the day we're going to talk about emotions. And one person in the front row said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Edwards, we don't have emotions. You don't need to talk about that. I was like, okay, nice segue. Here we go. Let's talk about emotions. What we have learned through neurobiology and magnetic resonance imaging and brain studies is that emotions are with us every moment. There is no cognitive thought without an attendant emotion. I invite people to think back on their past lives and try and recall whatever is vivid in your memory. And I submit that probably those memories that you recall have a strong emotion attached, whether it's a birthday party or the death of a family member or climbing up on a fence and getting bit by the neighbor's dog, one of mine. They're all attached to strong emotions. And therefore, emotions have a critical role to play in our ability to communicate. They certainly have a role to play in how conflicts come about. That's a duh kind of moment. But they also have, therefore, a role in how we unwind that ball of string, how we look for cues to help people address their needs and interests as we look for ways to address emotions in mediation. And all of that is a fairly recent new development, in the context of decades, if not centuries, of how we've approached dispute resolution. And I'm fond of telling stories generally to classes because I think stories are great ways of illustrating moments. I'll give you a story. Years ago, I traveled to Maine to mediate a case, which at the time was sort of the largest personal injury claim in the state of Maine. And a gentleman had, in a commercial environment, had walked into a room that he thought the door was just stuck. He unstuck it by yanking on it, pulled it open. It turned out to be a commercial oven, and he was hit with a wave of fire. And it burned him over about 90% of his body. And as you can imagine, his scarring was gruesome and significant. And we had a 3-day mediation in a conference center with dozens of people who had come from different parts of the country to mediate this dispute. And after a morning of going through some real basic legal arguments, I kind of surmised that what really wasn't helping was we needed to involve some emotion in this conversation. So I gathered everybody in a room about this size, and I went to the injured plaintiff and I said, I need you to personalize this claim. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, I need you to come into this room with me and I want to ask you some questions. Are you up for that? He said, yeah, whatever it takes. And so we wheeled him in from the private breakout room he'd been in, and we wheeled him down the center aisle of this room, and there were probably 50 people, and you could hear a pin drop as people sort of gasped at the scars, because for many it was the first time they had seen it in person. And he was wheeled up to the podium like this, and next to the stage, some of the defendants had built a life-size replica of this kiln, if you will, and what this guy had to do to access the door and open it. So here he was sitting next to that. And I took him through a number of questions, some that you would expect. My God, you've gone through over 200 operations to try and reconstruct through skin grafts some sense of being human. And I worked my way up to more difficult questions. And finally, I just, as a throwaway, I said, so, Mr. Smith, what's been the hardest part of going through this experience the last 2 years or more now? Is it the physical pain? What is it really you want people to know? He kind of looked up from his wheelchair at me. He said, Mr. Edwards, the hardest part of this is that nobody touches me anymore. And we sat there, and I let it sit. And I thanked him, and they wheeled him out of the room. And then I went and talked to him separately, and there were tears, really, on both sides, because, yes, sometimes in mediation, you can't help but be human. And but that brought emotions into the conversation, and that allowed us to sort of work through more difficult conversations down the road. Yes, they include law. Yes, they include facts. I mean, every day I start out with lawyers, and I assure you it's not all about, how are you feeling today. But so at some point, I'm there trying to get their clients into the conversation and give space for people to talk not just about law and facts, but about the emotional content of the dispute and what clues does that hold for us to find appropriate settlements. Don't overlook the importance of self-management of emotions. That's an example of managing emotions in others. Self-management of emotions, though, speaks to managing your own emotions. And here, everybody, starting with myself, can improve. Developing emotional competency is not something we're born with. We obviously learn emotional competency from the families we grow up in. And one of the exercises I often do with students in class is ask them to privately take out a sheet of paper, draw circles that show their family of origin. Who did you grow up with? What was the relationship between those parties? And then literally map out and scale what degrees of emotion were displayed in conflict moments between those family members as a way of helping people appreciate their learning and their life experience. Did you grow up in a Southern European family, to generalize for a moment, where everybody was yelling at people over dinner, but when people finally came together and finished their yelling, they were back being loving family members, and that was just part of the culture? Or maybe you came from a more Northern European example where there was conflict, but you didn't know what it was. All you knew is that nobody was talking with each other at the dinner table, and all you could hear was the clinking of silverware and china, and therefore, you knew something was wrong, but nobody knew exactly what it was. Helping people understand from where they come helps give them a sense of where they're headed. And as mediators, it's incumbent on us to get more comfortable with ourselves around emotions. The easiest way to think about it is using the metaphor of building an emotional muscle. Obviously, there's no such thing, but our ability to work in the presence of strong emotions takes energy, effort, and evolves over time. I've been in cases now where, and of course, helping lawyers develop their own emotional competency as part of mediation advocacy is an important part of training, because bringing people together in conflict environments obviously encourages some airing of that conflict. We found early on when we brought people together, it wasn't always controlled. Sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it was very emotional. Sometimes it was out of control from the lawyer's perspective. But the benefit of having that emotion laid bare in a direct conversation went miles toward helping us understand what the emotional issues were at play and what we needed to do to try and address them. And so that, to me, was one of the driving forces, and continues to be, of inviting people to come back into joint sessions when the tendency in the community of mediators is, and lawyers particularly, let's get at this negotiation, but getting together is only going to fan the flames of conflict. Understanding emotion and developing your own emotional strength in those moments is critical to your success. We once was mediating in San Francisco, and there was some loud yelling coming from the room next to me, and it got increasingly loud. It wasn't my case, but it was to the point where it was distracting. And so at one point I actually walked out, opened the door, walked into the hallway, and looked down the hallway toward the room. I realized there were about half a dozen other mediators doing the same, thinking that, maybe this was problematic. And out of the room walked Ed Pinelli, who's a former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's got somebody in tow. He walks out like it's just another day at a picnic, and he looks and he sees all these people staring at him. And he looks, he goes, "What? You haven't heard a couple Italian brothers having a disagreement?" And get back to your work, And it was a reflection of the fact that he was very comfortable in that environment of conflict. And as mediators, it's incumbent on us, as I say, to continually train ourselves to be comfortable too. And that's about self-management of your emotions. So this idea that we can become better mediators, but only by first looking inward to understand both our mental model, to understand our body image and how we relate to others physically, and ultimately how comfortable we are with our own emotions, is really critical to developing our ability to help other people. I think I'm going to pause there for a moment because you've been very polite in sort of listening to that opening. But I do want to be responsive to questions that people have, because I know not everybody had a chance last hour to finish their questions. But I'll just cap it by saying, this idea that mediation is about developing skills and tools in your toolbox, all of that is absolutely true to a point. But it really starts with this better understanding of oneself and the ability to sort of manage yourself and know how you are in relation to other people. And that is a continuous life journey. This idea of developing mediation competency, the idea that mediation begins with me, it's not a box to be checked, it's not a course to be completed, it's really a lifelong journey. For many people that's kind of scary, right? Because there is no end. But that's part of the beauty of it too. Because the more you learn about all of those things, the more adept you are in your own social competencies, the more effective you are in all of your communications, both with friends, relatives, loved ones, as well as people in mediation. And therefore, you can't possibly be a better mediator without also becoming a better person. And I tell that all the time to people who want to go into the practice. So understand it's a lifelong journey, but understand it's an important one that really does help you become one who can reach your fullest potential. So let me pause there and address questions, but thank you very much for kind of your kind attention. Questions?
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Harry.
Any questions from the audience here or from Zoom?
Give people a minute to get comfortable.
So maybe while people are thinking, maybe I'll toss something out to you. I am still kind of getting my head around a lot of this, and we've heard about mindfulness in mediation for a while now, and when I think of these two words together, I often think of people like Gary Friedman in the Bay Area, who's very well known for bringing this kind of perspective. He teaches with Norman Fisher at the Zen Center, in Mill Valley and so on. I don't think that's a type of mediation you're doing, though, the non-caucus model. Your mediations, my impression is that, there are these very high-level, complex cases involving, many dozens of lawyers at the same time and so on. Some of them may be personal injury, but others, I'm sure, are just straight commercial cases. And part of what I'm hearing from you is that the lesson, one of the lessons that you want us to take away from all of this is that, mindfulness is helpful in focusing us on the dynamics, not necessarily on what's being said, the numbers that are being exchange back and forth, the interest versus the positions, but sort of what's happening in the room, what is happening between the parties, this element of emotion not being thematized somehow in that mediation that you talked to us about, and noticing that, being aware of that in the moment, and then, bringing that into the conversation somehow, that is a skill that you're trying to kind of communicate to us. And so I guess my question is, you've thought a lot, obviously, about your cases, and there must have been a time when you were not using these mindfulness techniques, right? So since that time when you've started to reflect on mindfulness, can you think of mediations that you've done in the past, maybe, where you didn't use these mindfulness techniques, and you think, well, because of that, or one of the reasons why, it might explain why that mediation went south somehow? In other words, are there maybe some concrete examples you can give us where, by not using some of these mindfulness techniques, you felt maybe you were not able to salvage a mediation somehow, or maybe it didn't result in the kind of outcome that you were hoping for, the parties were hoping for? I know this is kind of indirect way of asking this question, but that's the way it felt intuitively to me.
So your question brings to mind a lot of different thoughts, so I'll try and address them in some order. Starting with Gary Friedman, back when I began mediating in 1980s, there was not really any mediation training to speak of, and I looked far and wide to see what I could learn. And so I went to Bill Lincoln's training up in Seattle. Bill Lincoln mediated prison riots. That was his specialty. And I figured, hell, if I can learn from a guy who mediates prison riots, I can figure out how to mediate a commercial case. And then I went to the Zen Center up in Marin because a friend, Vivian Williamson, had said, this guy Gary Friedman does family law, but there's really a lot of stuff there I think we can learn. So let's go disappear for a 3-day training weekend. And so an example of trying to expand your breadth of training and keeping an open mind to different things, because one aspect of conflict that is so apparent to me, particularly in my international teaching, is conflict is obviously part of the human condition. But that becomes so apparent when you're going from one country to the next country to the next country, and the threads that sort of run through the conversations are almost always the same. That's not to minimize cultural differences. Obviously there are. It's not to minimize the legal systems that they operate in. They're all often different, and their needs are different. But the underlying aspects of the conflict themselves bear such similar traits that it allows us to have conversations with international groups about how you resolve those, because the language of dispute resolution is therefore universal as well. Another aspect that I mentioned to the group an hour ago, but I think bears repeating, is while I talk with groups like you about these deeper processes of thinking, be it mindfulness or emotions or other things we bring into the mediation room to assist us as mediators, they're not the things that are necessarily always openly discussed. In fact, in many instances, they're not. The example I used, David, my friend here, will appreciate this, but when you're working on the $150 million BART extension with 50 people spread out around, the office for a couple days. You're not walking into rooms talking about, well, how do you feel today, hero, because it'll be helpful for me to understand your emotions as I work in trying to solve this problem. That's not the conversation you have with the silk stocking lawyer who's there with 3 clients and, wants $100 million. But that doesn't mean I'm not thinking about those things. I clearly am. And I'm trying to use those thoughts and lessons to my advantage to both connect at a deeper level with that person and effectively move them off of the positions that they've come with. Your question is a difficult one to answer. In other words, give me examples, if you will, because it's sort of reminiscent of sort of putting finer brushstrokes on a painting when I'm sort of thinking about broader brushstrokes at the moment. And the broader brushstrokes are, you're right, early in my career, I was, this was a long time ago. There wasn't mediation training. There wasn't a lot of this deep thinking about so much of our profession. A lot of what I was doing was based on principles of psychology that were pretty thin, not too deep, things that I had learned intuitively, growing up in a divorced family, working as a resident advisor for years in the dormitories in college, helping people solve problems, working in a men's resource and counseling center, listening to people talk. By the time I got to law school, I'd had this education by fire, if you will, in helping people address problems. But it wasn't one founded on knowledge. It was one sort of just founded on intuition. And so as I slowly progressed through my career and I learned some of the reasons that supported things I was doing intuitively, it gave me strength and conviction to continue in that direction. And that's true with mindfulness. As I told the class and you earlier, when I first started teaching in summer schools in Austria, and we brought in this guy, Dr. Daniel Siegel from UCLA, and he started talking about the power of mindfulness, not just intuitively as, we had people there you all know, Daniel Bowling, Dana Curtis, Rebecca Westerfield, people who had come from the West and were knowledgeable about meditation and mindfulness to a degree. But what we hadn't heard was the neurobiological support, the notion that this helped create neural pathways that promoted compassion and self-awareness by engaging in these repetitive techniques. And so that type of progressive learning allowed me to focus more sharply in my mediation, bringing mindfulness techniques, simple things like the doorknob technique I was talking about earlier, was something that came about because I was trying to figure out, in those days, I had 3 kids in 3 years. I should say my wife did. But there were mornings where I left the house with as much white noise going on in my head as one can imagine, dropping a couple kids off at school who were late, kids screaming at each other, and somehow 30 minutes later, I had to be in a completely different headspace. And how was I going to do that and do that effectively? And so that brought this mindfulness into the conversation, meditative techniques, and the doorknob technique as a way of becoming fully present to the people I was about to try and help. And so a lesson I carry forward to this day. So if you ask a question about, gee, are there cases in the past you screwed up? I know my words, not yours. You could have done differently. I'm sure there were. Hard to sort of think back that far and say, might this have made a qualitative difference? All I can say is that I have progressed meaningfully and sequentially over time to become not just a deeper thinker about the things we do, but hopefully a better communicator and a stronger connecting person, if you will, in the mediation environment. And that's a result of these kinds of conversations, if that answers your question. You see a hand?
Rachel Ehrlich has her hand up.
Hello, Rachel.
Bruce.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. The question that I have is, you talked about a particular case in which there were tears by everybody, including you, was the implication. And I'm curious about that because there are cases in which people are they're very emotional cases and folks do cry. And I'm curious about how you normalize mediator tears when they happen. Because I used to say, there's crying in mediation, but not by the mediator. But there are some where we do cry.
Thank you, Rachel. Great question. Look, there's a tension in mediation because we are at one level sort of emotional first responders, right? We get always, if we're going to be successful, almost always, we have to get close to the flame. We've got to somehow take on the emotions of others to a degree, yet we have to be self-protective in that exercise at the same time. Yet how one navigates that path is not always perfect. And as humans, we have emotions. I can tell you there are cases when my kids were young and I was a new father, and I would deal with cases involving the drowning of a 2-year-old who found his way into a neighbor's backyard and into a swimming pool, and the parents sat there and cried in front of me. It would bring tears to your eyes. You would be unhuman if it didn't. And I could give you lots of those kinds of scenarios. To Rachel's question and how to answer it, I think what you have to do is just acknowledge the notion that this is a very human moment and that you empathize with the people who are telling the story. And there's nothing shameful or wrong about evidencing some degree of emotion. Usually what I'll say is something like, I'm sorry that I'm responding maybe in the way I am, but I can't help myself. I think all of us feel a certain amount of emotion just listening to your story. let's take a break for a couple minutes. Let's sort of gather ourselves. And when I come back, let's continue this conversation in a different direction. But for now, thank you for sharing that, because it's an important part of, obviously, what we have to talk about today. So attempting to try and normalize it, Rachel, in the context, to use your word, in the context of mediation. And, you know, obviously there's always the concern that somebody's going to perceive you as siding with the side that evokes the emotion. You know, I sort of reject that line of thought by and large. It's not like, you know, you're sliding over in your chair next to them and putting your arm around them and handing them the tissue. Creates a different mental image. You know, but certainly responding in an emotional way, I think, helps deepen the connection. And that's what we're looking to do always in mediation. So acknowledging, addressing that connection, giving people license to be emotional. I'm always reminding people, sometimes telling them for the first time, look, I'm going to ask you some questions about what you went through. Don't be surprised if it starts to bring back emotions. Or when people start to cry or evidence other emotions, when I ask them to recount a story, I say to them, this is an example of bringing psychology into the room, or neurobiology. I say, look, I can't ask you to recall a fact that doesn't bring up an attached emotional element. It just can't happen. So it's only natural that when I ask you to talk about what happened the day of the accident, that you've sort of compartmentalized it somewhere to try and protect yourself, but now you bring it out into light and you talk about it and the emotions come along with it. I understand that's the normal part of neurobiology, so I would keep a box of tissues in every room. So by all means, tell me what happened and don't feel bad at all about bringing the emotion along with it. So emotions are very much a part of the conversation. They should be. And how we react to that as mediators is both illustrative of our own emotional competency and a real bellwether to how we're going to deal with people in the presence. And look, we could talk all day about emotions, but I'll give you this thought too. I'm trying to remember the philosopher's name. Ludwig Wittgenberg, I think. Wittgenstein, thank you. The limits of my words are the limits of my world. And I quote that, not effectively, obviously, but I quote that periodically to drive home the message that the words we use to describe our environment, and particularly emotions, have an impact on how we perceive them and or dismiss them. And so much about how we've historically worked with emotions has been dismissing them entirely or downplaying their significance. Controlling emotions, dealing with emotions, overcoming emotions. Let's take a break so you can get your emotions under control. Whether it's on a jury stand or in mediation, it's all the same. The language we're using about emotions is not welcoming. It's not confirmatory. It's not accepting. And so what we really need to do is sort of be cautious and rethink how we're inviting emotions into the room at the same time we're working on our own emotional competency. So it's a broader conversation, but I just wanted to put that out there. Just part of this self-reflective exercise is what words attach to the word emotion as an adverb or descriptive phrase when I typically use the word emotion. Think about that, write down some words, and then talking about how you correct your behaviors and develop new neural pathways, physically write down by hand new words to attach to emotions that reflect a more welcoming approach to emotion. And therein, you'll start to become more accepting of authentic displays of emotion in mediation as one particular tool. Did that answer your question, Rachel?
Competently, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, do we have a question?
Clark has a question or a comment?
No question.
Okay.
So you alluded to my research and teaching about recognizing emotions in others, and so let's say we often think about emotions being internal emotion. What emotions am I experiencing right now? But there's also external emotion, seeing what there is in the room, and sometimes it's obvious. People are crying, so it's sadness. But you were there when I did something for JAMS on how to recognize emotions in the face. And one thing I'm curious about is there's a traditional teaching that when there's micro-expressive emotions, so like this little half smile of contempt, for example, or the inner eyebrows go up, and so you know there's distress. That's probably the most reliable one. The person, like a party or the attorney, they may or may not be aware of that. It could be that they're suppressing the emotion, they're aware of it, but trying to clamp down on it, right? Traditional Western way. or they're repressing it. They're not even aware that they're sad. They're not even aware that they're judgmental. So I'm just curious, and this really goes back to what you talked about Kahneman, instead of type 1 and type 2 thinking. When you make a decision, you see this emotion in someone there, you implicitly decide, or maybe it's just, type 2 thinking, you just do it. Is it helpful to mention this directly or indirectly? Directly meaning something like, I get the feeling you're feeling judgmental, as opposed to indirectly, a lot of people in your position would feel judgmental about the insurers that are in the other room. So I'm curious about how do you do it? What are some ways that you notice the emotion? But also, if you can think about it, because maybe it's just type 1, it's automatic, but how do you decide how to confront and engage with the emotion or not?
How to do what?
How to engage with the emotion. So do you mention it to the person? Do you just realize, you know what, they're getting angry? It's the spark before the flames, the Dalai Lama says. And you're like, so let me call a break right now. But I'm not going to say, hey, you're getting angry. I'm instead going to say, oh, wow, I had a lot of water on my plate. I need to go to the bathroom for 5 minutes.
Give people space to sort of regather. I'll comment on emotions, certainly, because I think it's helpful to make sure that you're reading people and the room correctly. Right? It's clear to me, Clark, you're upset by what I've shared with you. Remember the first rule of mediation, don't shoot the messenger. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't come down the hall and tell you what I'm hearing from others, because we need to be able to respond. So forgive me if that's inciting you to sort of think about things in a way that's negative for you, right? Or, as you point out, micro expressions. Lots of times I don't get to finish the sentence, before I realize how it's impacting somebody. And I might stop mid-sentence and say, Clark, if this is too painful, at the moment, we can come at it another time. I'm perfectly comfortable with that if you want to take a break. But what I don't want to do is unnecessarily antagonize you. Right? I can see from your expression that was a sort of, you probably perceive that to be offensive. If I'm wrong, tell me. But otherwise, understand that we'll take a break. I try and be as open, both in welcoming authentic displays of emotion, because as mediators we deal with the inauthentic displays of emotion, the people who put on emotion for the sake of strategic, positioning. That's slightly different. Another related topic to this that I think impacts the question is a whole different conversation about Zoom mediation and the virtual world we live in and the impact on our ability in the first instance to monitor and respond to micro expressions, much less macro expressions, right? I joke about it, but I've written blogs because it frustrates the hell out of me. We'll have a camera at one end of the room, and I'll have a long conference table. There'll be 6 lawyers and 3 clients 35 feet away, and they're about as far as you are from me as this on the screen, and half of them are wearing masks, right? And now I'm trying to not only manage the conflict in all of the ways that we would traditionally think about managing the conflict, but now I've got this whole overlay of communication issues. It may be that somebody's verbal cues are slightly out of sync with the auditory cues coming through their computer because of bandwidth issues. Now your mind's working overtime to match up the lips and the words, and that creates Zoom fatigue, the studies have shown, as a whole different layer of challenge to us as mediators. I had a case where a gentleman and his wife were struck by an Uber driver over in Berkeley, and she was killed and he was injured. He was African American, which is only relevant because the Zoom link that we had that day came from his home. He had very poor lighting, and he was in the midst of really sharing something very emotional with me, but I could not see the features of his face given the dim lighting in his living room, as one example of the impact that some of this technology has on our communication. I could go on with a laundry list of those kinds of challenging communication issues brought about by Zoom, but it has impacts in terms of emotions as well. If I'm sitting across from somebody having this conversation and they begin to have tears and describe things in an emotional way, it's much harder for me to connect. I just finished a case involving about 7 or 8 young women at a gymnastics studio in Las Vegas who had been sexually abused by a gymnastics coach. And we had a mix of in-person mediation, of virtual mediation, and hybrid mediation, all in the same case, spread out over different days and different mediation efforts. It was an interesting study, if you will, on some of the communication challenges, both sort of strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. That's separate and apart from the case itself, just the technology and the communication piece. And so as we think about emotions, think about structurally some of the things we have control over in setting up the mediation that can have a profound influence on how emotions could potentially play out in the mediation room itself. And in a case like that, interestingly, everybody thought we should start the mediation in person, and we did. I went to Las Vegas, 15 rooms full of people. I walk into the plaintiff's room. There's one young woman. There's 7 others on a screen. I turn to the plaintiff's counsel and I go, what's the thinking here? Well, we want to protect them from all of this. Okay, I understand that. Let's talk about that for a moment. And over time, we continued the process. More and more of them came in and felt comfortable in a safe space to participate. So, there's a lot that goes into the emotional piece, but don't overlook the sort of structural aspects of it that can help that process.
Any final questions? Because we're running out of time. Oh, we have
Casey?
one.
Oh, another question on the screen?
I think that's just Karen.
No? That's Karen saying dinner time?
Maybe as Karen saying, it's time for the reception piece. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing your thoughts about mindfulness and mediation, and for being the finale, really, in our 2023 ADR speaker series. It was really a treat to be able to have you share your thoughts with us. You were one of the 2 practitioners in this series. It's really great to be able to get this practical insight from you about how mindfulness has affected your practice. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For being here.
Thank you.